OHDO to help on the road to zero. We are going to get started at this time. I'm going to close out all of these polls along the outside and give you a few bits of information from them. It looks like today the majority of you are joining us from the Southeast at 30%. We have about 25% of you from the Midwest, 18% from the West, and another 18% from the Northeast. It also looks like we have most of you joining us in an office by yourself, but there are a few of you in groups of 2 to 3 people. I will give you a few instructions in just a bit on what to do if you are in one of those groups. It also looks like most of you, 40% of you are joining us from a state DOT. We have about 35% from other federal, state, or local government agency. 20% from private consultants, and about 5% from local DOTs today. And most of you are joining us on the computer only. If you are one of the 80% joining us by computer only, if you do have audio issues, we would ask you to please dial into the webinar. You can find that phone number in the top left corner. It is an 866 number. Many of the times, if you do experience audio issues listening only through the computer, it is your internet signal itself, so if you wouldn't mind calling in on the phone. I'm going to move us over to our presentation, and then we will go through a few instructions for everyone who has never joined us before. So a few webinar logistics for you. The duration of this webinar will be an hour and a half. It is being recorded and will be archived on our website. For quality of the recording, everyone's phone lines have been muted for the presentation. If you are listening by phone, we would ask you to please mute your computer, otherwise you will hear some feedback, and this includes our 3 presenters as well. To maximize the presentation, in case there are graphics that are too small and you'd like to see them a little bit bigger, you can click the 4 arrow keys that point outward in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and that will get rid of all of the extraneous information around the outside of the pod and let you just see the presentation itself as a bigger piece. At the end of each section, we will stop for question and answer, so there will be 3 question and answer periods today. As I've mentioned before, your phone line is muted, so we will do question and answer via the chat pod on the left-hand side of your screen. You can feel free to put your questions in there at any time, and when we do stop, I will scroll back through that chat pod and read those questions out to our presenters. So don't feel like you have to hold your question until the end of their time speaking. Right below that chat pod, you'll also find a handout pod, and in there is the PDF version of today's slides. You're more than welcome to download that. It will also be available on our website when we post the streaming version of today's webinar. For anyone who was joining us in a group, you can send a list of who is joining you and their emails to us at info@ruralsafetycenter.org. This will allow us to send you the surveys, which I'm going to talk about next. So we do 2 separate surveys following our webinars. The first one will come out directly following today's webinar, and that one is just asking you a little bit of information about our speakers and the topic, but most importantly, this is where you will check whether or not you would like a certificate of completion or CEUs. So we do want to make sure that you receive these surveys. The second one will be sent in 3 months, and that one is just for us to find out how you've used the information you learned today. Perhaps at the end of this, you go and talk to some of your coworkers about RTPOs and how you might start one in your area, or you share this with a client that you're working with. So we're just looking for that kind of information, how you've used this webinar presentation. So for the certificates of completion and CEUs, the survey for today's webinar can also now be found on your screen at the top. It will also be available via that PDF that I mentioned in the handout pod. Again, this will be emailed to you directly following today's webinar as well. However, we have found that sometimes it gets stuck in junk folders and it's hard for you guys to find. So this is the link as well. The very last 2 questions will ask you whether or not you'd like this certificate of completion or CEU. Our surveys close 2 weeks after the webinar, so you can expect your certificates and CEUs about 3 to 4 weeks after the webinar. We do manually create these, so sometimes it does take us a little bit longer. The CEU forms will be emailed to you with that certificate of completion. You fill those out and submit them to continuinged@montana.edu, not back to the Safety Center. That is something that Montana State University does for you guys. It is free. The bottom of the form, if you do look at it, will ask you about paying for it. You do not have to pay for these CEUs. The Safety Center has already covered that cost. You can also request a verification of completion of these CEUs to turn in. You can see right here on this next screen, the top left is the course registration form, which we'll have you fill out, and the bottom right is an example of the example for transcript or verification of completion that you would get if you do request one of these. And so today I would like to talk to you about our three presenters. First we have Steve Gayle. And Stephen is the director at RSG. He has a national reputation in metropolitan and statewide transportation planning as a practitioner, educator, facilitator, and policy analyst. He spent 30 years at the Binghamton, New York Metropolitan Transportation Study as executive director. He was involved in all aspects of planning and program. Stephen has expertise in safety planning, performance-based planning and programming, and in freight planning. He is a certified instructor for the National Highway Institute. He is a past international president of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. And outside of the office, Stephen is a member of Gilbertsville, New York Fire Department, where he has practiced rural EMS since 1981. Our next speaker will be Scott Phinney, the administrator from OHDOT. Scott serves as the administrator of OHDOT's Office of Statewide Planning and Research. His office performs ODOT's long-range planning, research, and transportation demand modeling functions. Scott has been with ODOT for 25 years, serving both as one of ODOT's local district offices and at the ODOT headquarters in Columbus. Scott is a member of the TRB Committee on Statewide Multimodal Planning and a licensed professional engineer in Ohio. Scott has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Ohio State University. And finally, we will have Matt Kunic, the manager of the Tribal and Regional Coordination Office at Washington State DOT as well. Matt is the manager, as I mentioned, of the Tribal and Regional Coordination Office within Washington State DOT's Multimodal Planning Division, which has oversight of the MPO and RTPO programs and leads Washington DOT's MAP 21 collaboration with MPOs and RTPOs. In his current role working with regional transportation planning organizations in Washington, and in his previous role working with the rural planning organizations and Transit Authority in North Carolina, bringing the state, regions, and locals together to ensure a coordinated and collaborative process has been one of utmost importance. Matt will show some of the similarities and differences between MPOs and RTPOs in Washington, along with explaining how the state, regions, and locals are involved in decision-making processes at the RTPO. After today's webinar, we hope that you will have an overview of the FHWA-funded RTPO Fact Sheets, an RTPO 101 series, and an RTPO Noteworthy Practice, as well as case studies, including tips and tricks on creation of an RTPO from both Ohio and Washington. And to achieve this, we have 5 different learning objectives for you. The first is to identify noteworthy practices in regional transportation planning. Secondly is to summarize how to start an RTPO from scratch, the Ohio case study. Third will be to differentiate between an MPO and RTPO, the Washington case study. And fourth will be how to illustrate how to incorporate locals into the decision-making process when creating an RTPO Washington case study. Finally, we had asked if anyone had questions that they'd like submitted to the panel beforehand, and we did not receive any, so we are hoping that we will get a lot of questions from you guys through the chat pod today. Again, that's on the left-hand side. And now I am going to turn our presentation over to Stephen to begin. Stephen?
Thank you. Good day to all of you, morning to some, afternoon to others. I'm happy to be presenting. As Jamie indicated, I led a project for our firm, RSG, for the Federal Highway Administration Office of Planning to document RTPO state of the practice. This was in 2014, 2015. So I'm going to give you some background and some of the noteworthy practices we turned up. We interviewed individuals from 4 state DOTs and the regional planning agencies within those states, and found a lot of interesting things. So let me start with some context. Metropolitan planning, Congress created the requirement for MPOs way back in 1973, but for rural areas, the state DOTs have always been responsible for doing transportation planning in rural areas. MAP 21, the federal transportation bill in 2012, states, as you see, in carrying out planning under this section, each state shall, at a minimum, with respect to non-metropolitan areas, cooperate with affected local officials with responsibility for transportation, or if applicable, through regional transportation planning organizations. So get used to the word non-metropolitan. That's the federal lingo instead of saying rural. It's basically the country is divided into metropolitan areas under the census and non-metropolitan areas. So a section of the law in MAP 21 reads this, and I've highlighted the word may. Some of you may understand that a shall condition means you have to do it. So the previous slide, states have to cooperate with non-metropolitan officials, but they may establish and designate regional transportation planning organization. And that's where RTPO comes from. And the purpose of doing that under the federal law is to enhance planning coordination and implementation of the state's long-range plans and transportation improvement programs. Just an aside here on nomenclature, because you will hear these rural regional planning organizations referred to by lots of names, lots of acronyms. So the federal government, federal designation is RTPO, as it says here, Regional Transportation Planning Organization. Although you will also hear later in the presentation that some states have adopted that same name without doing the federal designation. You also hear RPO, Regional or Rural Planning Organization. We have regional planning commissions, regional planning associations, regional planning economic development boards, and so on and so forth. So lots of names, lots of different kinds of organizations, but we're going to be focusing on, I'm going to be focusing on the federally designated RTPO, the Regional Transportation Planning Organization. So for MAP 21, the federal law spelled out exactly what you have to do if you are a state, and you'll hear this from Scott, but if you are a state and you want to designate one or more RTPOs, they have to meet certain requirements. You can't simply say, oh, this regional planning organization, we're going to start calling them a federally designated RTPO. So they have to have a policy committee that covers multiple jurisdictions, and that policy committee must be made up of primarily non-metropolitan local officials, elected officials. It may include others like operators of transportation services, transit operators, economic development representatives, and so forth. Again, if you're familiar with MPOs, the same kinds of members who may be on an MPO policy committee or board. RTPOs can't be standalone organizations with respect to federal activities, federal funds. They have to have a fiscal administrative agent. This next bullet is really key. They are required to prepare a long-range transportation plan and a transportation improvement program. Again, very much looking like an MPO. They provide a forum for public participation. They coordinate with their local government partners, both to coordinate local planning efforts around transportation and other functions, as we'll see. And also the expectation that they may be able to provide technical assistance to local governments, GIS mapping, for example. And they're expected to collaborate with neighboring RTPOs and MPOs if they, in fact, have such neighbors. So I want to spend a minute translating all that legalese stuff into actual practice and why RTPOs bring value, and then we'll step through a series of noteworthy practices. And the whole point is that rural regional organizations know the local issues. They know the terrain, literally and figuratively. State DOTs, as we all know, it's their function, and it varies from state to state depending on how much of the roadway system they have jurisdiction over. But their focus is on higher level roadway facilities. And where that comes into play, here's one example on infrastructure, that an RTPO understands that low volume local roads and bridges provide access to economic generators like agriculture and mining and timber, and have heavy truckloads. And those bridges, you know, if you used a standard project selection criteria like daily traffic, AADT, many of these roadways, including the two you see pictures of here, they have an AADT of less than 100 vehicles a day and would not rise to the point of being funded for a bridge replacement project. But again, this is something that the RTPO would understand the economic impact in their county, in their region. Some other thoughts about translating law into practice. This is all about safety, and I'll reference safety a few more times as we go through my presentation. So local organizations, regional organizations, if you put the first two bullets together, they know about specific high crash locations in their region on rural roads. As Jamie mentioned, I've been involved in rural EMS for half a lifetime. So an RTPO may be able to say to the state DOT, we need to fix this high crash location because it's 45 minutes by ambulance to the closest trauma center, and helicopter service is really questionable. We have one helicopter serving 4 counties. Resiliency. Resiliency is a new planning factor under the FAST Act, the newest federal transportation bill. States, MPOs have to look at the resiliency of their roadway systems, highway systems, in the face of severe weather events. So again, the RTPO may have a better picture, a better understanding of the detours that may result because of fewer redundant routes in a rural area than in an urban or suburban setting. And finally, special issues. We have a state park. We have a summer-long Renaissance Fair Festival. We are in Vermont and have a 5-month ski season that is preceded by a 6-week leaf-peeping foliage season. So we have these things that generate seasonal heavy traffic on our local roads that we need to be able to program projects for or talk to the state DOT about. So now I begin with the noteworthy practices we discovered. And the first one is most of these RTPOs, RPOs, within their walls as one agency do multiple planning functions, and this is really helpful, and the public really benefits. I put transportation in the middle. That's our focus today. But for example, when the transportation planner, instead of being at the state DOT district or region office, can just walk down the hall and talk to somebody at the area agency on aging about the public health issues related to isolated rural senior citizens not being able to get to health care. Or the economic development director can come in and say, so we have a potential significant employer who may want to build in our county, but they need better highway access or maybe even rail access. So including all these functions in one office, in one agency, is, as I said, it's really beneficial to the transportation program and to the public throughout that rural region. When we talked to folks from Caltrans, one of them was very specific about how under their state law, they call them Regional Transportation Planning Agencies, RTPAs, how important they are to the state doing its statewide transportation improvement program, that they understand that multi-county rural districts, regions, that the district planners certainly won't know as much about what's needed for the transportation system for potential projects as the Regional Transportation Planning Organization. The regional plan, as I said, the long-range regional plan is a requirement for RTPOs. The North Central Pennsylvania Regional Planning and Development Commission, they've been a star in rural planning for a long time. They do great work. Amy Kessler, their transportation planning director, has often said, we have to act like MPOs to make sure that we get treated, the rural needs get treated as well as the metropolitan needs. So they have a long-range transportation plan. It's adopted by their board. It's used to guide decision-making on expenditures. And it's multimodal. It covers everything that we would expect: roadways, transit, bicycle pedestrian facilities, freight, and even rail and air facilities. And it looks at the linkages between transportation and economic development and land use. Another long-range regional transportation plan, Nevada County, California, their Transportation Commission. They're on the California side of the Lake Tahoe area. Part of their county is very recreation-centered, and the other half is not. So this was their 2010 20-year regional transportation plan, split into a 10-year short-term and a 10-year long-term set of policies, needs, and again across a whole set of multimodal needs: roadways, including intelligent transportation systems, management and operations of their transportation system. They also included rail and air and freight and non-motorized and public transit. So these are great examples of rural planning organizations doing excellent long-range transportation plans. And then we take the step down from the 20-year plan to the 4-year federally required transportation improvement program and the statewide, the STIP. And different states interact with their rural organizations differently in finding projects to include in their STIP. Here in southeast Iowa, the Regional Planning Commission prepares a 4-year regional TIP that is very similar to the MPO TIPs. They are given the authority to program certain Federal Highway Administration fund sources, including Surface Transportation Program block grant funds. And they invite their municipal members, their counties and cities, to submit applications, candidate project applications for those funds. And Iowa also gives each of the regional agencies an allocation of Transportation Alternative Program funds. And they use a competitive award process there to pick the projects. Safety planning, again, key to what we're talking about today. So Boonslick Regional Planning Commission in Missouri, outside of St. Louis, or the rural area, did a great regional safety study. This was part 1, and then they had a subsequent part with recommendations. I think the key here, if you read that quote, they were acting as a facilitator, as a link between local needs and Missouri DOT, helping both the local governments through a quantitative data-driven safety study understand what the local needs were, helping MoDOT understand what the local and regional needs were with respect to safety in their 3-county region. I mentioned resiliency. This is in Vermont. Vermont has 1 MPO, and the rest of the state is divided border to border among 12 regional planning commissions. Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission has been assisting the Vermont Agency of Transportation with its resiliency planning. And that was really driven by the devastation from Hurricane Irene in 2011. That photo you see on the slide is Route 4, one of just a handful of east-west routes across south and central Vermont. most of the road washed out. They lost more than 100 bridges, many, many miles of roadways. And in this case, the Regional Commission, the RPO, can say, well, we understand from a network perspective, you can't necessarily put everything back. So here's what's important for our residents to be able to get to critical facilities after a storm, for utility companies to come in to restore power after a storm. Public participation has been a central focus of the planning process since there was a planning process. So we go back to Boonslick in Missouri. As it says here, they have 26 cities in 3 counties. They have taken on the task of acting as a liaison, just as they did with their safety study. They're the bridge between the local communities and the Missouri DOT. We all understand how much of a challenge public participation, public outreach is, even in urban areas, but especially so in rural areas. Expecting people to travel 20 or 30 miles to go to a public meeting, not very realistic. So in this case, the RPC staff has taken on the commitment to attend the meetings and act as the ears and voices of their constituents. Land use planning, again, back to Nevada County in California. California did something called the Rural Regional Blueprint Program, which they used in collaboration with their stakeholders, with their local governments, with their public, to knit together and study transportation and land use to lead to sustainable regional growth. So they took advantage of this state opportunity to say, what transportation choices should we make in our long-range plan to facilitate the kind of future land use that we're looking for, to facilitate our development goals that help reach our vision. And finally, driving towards zero. That's the title of this webinar. So here's some thoughts that I have about how RTPOs can help drive the numbers down. You can participate when your state is updating their strategic highway safety plan and provide input on the critical needs and strategies that make sense in rural areas. You can identify those local safety needs that you turned up by doing a long-range transportation plan. You can put forth candidate safety projects in the regional tip to be considered for the statewide tip. And perhaps the most important are the last 2 bullets. You can engage the board members, policy committee members, the local elected officials in making a choice to prioritize safety when they decide how they're going to invest transportation dollars. And then because, again, RTPOs are closer to their constituents than state agencies, state DOTs, they're a good organization to communicate safety messages to their constituents. So with that, I will wrap up. And as Jamie said, you can type any questions in the chat pod, and I will be happy to answer them.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And while we are waiting to see if anyone has any questions for Stephen, we are going to ask you guys a question. So I'll move us over to our poll break. So our first poll for you is, noteworthy practices in regional transportation planning include which of the following? To serve multiple planning functions in one agency, to provide a multimodal focus, to officially adopt plans to guide decision makers, to conduct regional safety studies, implement resiliency planning, serve as a liaison between local communities and the DOT, create sustainable regional growth, conduct public outreach in rural areas, all of the above, none of the above, or I do not know, don't remember. We'll just give you a few seconds to fill that out. And again, the chat pod's on the left-hand side if anyone has any questions thus far. Okay, and at this point it does look like everyone has put in their answers, so I'm going to broadcast those results. Stephen, you should see them now if you'd like to address them.
Yeah, so it seems like most of you who participated in the poll got the fact that all of the above was the best answer, that the slide, the noteworthy practices that I covered, and again, you can see those in those 2 series of FHWA fact sheets, are in fact all of those functions that an RTPO can serve.
Perfect, thank you. And it looks like at this point we do not have any additional questions, so I am going to move us on to the next section. And if we have any questions come in for you, we'll make sure to ask those as we get to the next 2 sections. And now we are going to turn the webinar over to Scott, who's going to talk about Ohio DOT and their case study. So Scott?
Well, thank you. Really happy to be able to share with everyone today about how Ohio was able to develop RTPOs in our state. And so just a little bit of an outline here on the types of things that I'm going to talk about today, how we got started in Ohio, how RTPOs are set up, how they're funded, what they do, and what authority they have. Now, as I go through the presentation, sometimes you might hear me refer to them as RTPOs, and as Steve said a few moments ago, sometimes these agencies are called by different names. And in Ohio, we use 2 different terms. We use RPO, Rural Planning Organization, and RTPO, which is the MAP 21 phrase, Regional Transportation Planning Organization. And kind of how we think of it here in Ohio is when a rural planning organization is created, they kind of come into life as an RPO. And after they go through a pilot program, which I'll be talking to you about here momentarily, once they get through that program, they kind of graduate to becoming an RTPO. And so if you hear me using those terms, that's kind of how it works. So in Ohio, how regional planning got started in Ohio is as Steve said, we've had MPOs in Ohio for decades. And this map here shows the parts of the state that are covered by regional transportation planning, albeit through an MPO. And so you can see in Ohio we have 17 MPOs, and it I'll say touches 30 of the 88 counties in the state. Certainly some counties are completely covered by an MPO, but then there are other places where there's only a small portion of the county, particularly along the Ohio River, where we have MPOs that border between Ohio and Kentucky, or Ohio and West Virginia. And so, as you can also see from the map, there's quite a bit of the state, those counties shown in white, that aren't represented by any sort of regional transportation planning. And so, what do we do with those? So, I mean, like in those areas that are covered by MPOs, when someone comes along and plants an IKEA, the MPO is who OHDOT works with to try and manage how is this land use around the IKEA going to change? How are we going to manage traffic? What are going to be some of the needs? But then when we go to a setting like this, who does OHDOT coordinate with? There's just so many counties. There are 88 counties in Ohio. In each county there's multiple townships, there's multiple cities and villages, and honestly OHDOT is not staffed, and we do not have the capacity to interface with every community the way it should be. And so in these rural areas, we really don't have a good ability. Yes, just like the quote that Steve showed earlier from California, we have district offices. We have 12 district offices in Ohio, and they are really sort of our front line with these local communities. Even those district offices do not have the staffing or the ability or the time to interface with all the local communities and really facilitate good transportation planning. And so with this in mind, OHDOT decided that we really wanted to develop and grow regional transportation planning in Ohio. Yes, part of it was to provide an opportunity for locally elected officials, stakeholders, an opportunity to meaningfully participate in the statewide transportation planning process, but it also was going to help us be able to make a better decision in rural areas and to really cover the entire state. That's our goal. We want to cover the entire state with regional transportation planning, whether that be through an MPO or an RTPO. That is going to really help us more effectively make decisions and really provide meaningful opportunity to participate in statewide transportation planning. And so as we thought about this, we were like, well, where are we going to start? And fortunately, in Ohio, there were already 5 rural planning organizations. And so they're shown on the map here. Some of them are bigger than others, but these 5 rural planning organizations have existed in Ohio almost as long as the MPOs. Many of them were started in the late 60s, early 70s, and have been around for years and years and years. And they do all sorts of planning for their communities. They do economic development. They do some land use, housing, transit in some cases, but not much. But the one big thing that they were missing is that none of these had any transportation planning experience. It was sort of the jewel in their crown that they were missing, that they always wanted to add to the services that they provided their communities, but just never either had the time, the money, the opportunity to get something going. And so what Ohio decided to do was in the winter of 2013, we issued a request for proposal, and we started a pilot program, and we sent this RP out to these 5 RPOs and said that we were offering to fund 2 of them to begin developing the ability and the capability of functioning as hopefully one day as an RTPO, to add transportation planning into their expertise. And we were floored to get responses from all 5. And all 5 of the RPOs in Ohio, we could tell it was obvious. They put a lot of time, a lot of thought into creating their proposal, and they were very serious, and they were very excited about the opportunity. And so, we were hoping when we put this RFP out that we would get 2, and we got 5, and we just saw this as a tremendous opportunity to really expand regional transportation planning in Ohio very quickly. And so we accepted all 5 proposals. And so instead of just piloting with 2 agencies, we piloted with all 5. And so beginning in July of 2013, we launched a 2-year pilot program. And so in addition to the 30 counties that were already represented by MPOs, we added 34 more counties in the state that were now going to be covered by regional transportation planning through the RPOs. And so to kind of help you see this graphically, this is a map I showed earlier showing the coverage of MPOs. And by adding the RPOs, we've significantly gained in terms of the amount of coverage in the state for regional transportation planning. There's still some white counties, some areas in white that aren't represented, but this was a significant and quantum leap forward in coverage. And so we were very excited about this. And so as we move forward into this pilot program, we had 4 key goals for each of these RPOs. One, we needed their help. We needed their help to provide interagency consultation with stakeholders as we go through our STIP process. And so we really needed them to be able to be that in-between between OHDOT as a state agency and all of the local communities in the public. So that was one key thing that we wanted out of this relationship. We also wanted to see them develop their transportation planning experience. Each of these agencies pretty much started from nothing. They started from 0. And so we wanted to build that up. The other thing that we wanted to help them develop is some experience in dealing with OHDOT. OHDOT has a number of funding programs that local communities can apply to get funding for their local projects, and many of those are related to safety. But most counties, most townships, cities, villages, their transportation planning departments are very small, and they don't have the time or the resources or the skill to figure out how do they navigate through ODOT's system to apply for grants. They have no experience to know what to put into their grant applications to make them competitive. And so in working with the RPOs, we wanted them to be able to gain that experience and then turn around and guide and help their local communities in applying for funding from ODOT for their various capital projects. And so that was another important key goal of this. And then lastly, we wanted each of the RPOs to develop their own long-range transportation plan. So that's what we were hoping to get out of it, and that's exactly what we got. All 5 agencies within the 2-year pilot program turned in long-range transportation plans. I've included 3 of the covers here. I didn't want to add 5. It just kind of clutter up the slide a little bit, but here's the covers of 3 of them. And these plans, they just kind of have the basics of what you would expect to see in a long-range transportation plan. It's just sort of planning 101 between goals and objectives, existing future conditions, needs analysis, fiscal analysis. We wanted them to have a robust stakeholder participation to make sure that the communities that they serve felt like they were engaged and had meaningfully participated in the development of the plan. And then we also wanted to see some recommendations coming out of that. And so one of the big things that led to the success of all these plans was at the very beginning we knew as we were getting these pilot programs started, as we were trying to birth these RTPOs, we didn't have the experience. We are good at statewide transportation planning, but at regional planning, honestly, we don't have any experience. We don't know what it's like. Now, the agencies that do know what it's like are the 17 MPOs in the state. And so what we did was with each one of our new fledgling RPOs, RTPOs, is that we partnered them up with sort of an older brother MPO. It would be an MPO that was in the region or nearby that would kind of guide them, coach them, mentor them through the process, help them understand that, okay, well, when ODOT says this, what they really mean is, and they could coach them and help them to get on their feet and get up to speed quickly. Now, for these 5 MPOs that we partnered up with them, we did provide them some funding so that they would feel like they could really devote time, that they could be reimbursed for their time that they spent in trying to get these RTPOs up and running and get them functioning as a RTPO. And so as we finished up the process and we looked back and we sort of debriefed with the RTPOs and tried to find out as they went through this pilot program, hey, what worked well, what didn't work well. The big thing that we heard from all of them was that they were so thankful, they were so grateful for the coaching that they received from their mentoring MPO. They said that by far was the biggest key to their success, was that partnership. And so, you know, I guess that could be the one big takeaway from Ohio, is that as you're starting RPOs, RTPOs from scratch, just getting these agencies up and going and functioning, partnering them up with another agency, an MPO in the region that could understand them, understand what they were going through, encourage them, coach them, is just a must-have if you want to see that up and successful. So that was something that we just sort of fell into by accident, but it seemed like a good idea at the outset of the pilot program, but at the end of the pilot program, we were so glad that we had done that because it really made the difference. Now, moving on to how are RPOs set up? Well, to create an RPO, the title of this presentation is Creating an RTPO from Scratch. I guess that may be a little bit of a stretch because RPOs already existed, but to create a new RPO in Ohio, there's a couple of things that you need to look at in terms of state requirements. They have to be organized either as a regional planning commission or council of governments under Ohio Revised Code. And then there are also some federal requirements that just talks about having the support of a public agency to provide fiduciary functions and make sure that accounting functions are served and meet federal requirements. How does one become an RTPO? And as I said at the outset, these organizations kind of begin life as an RPO. They enter a 2-year pilot program with OHDOT. They have to develop the same sort of committee structures you see at a MPO. They need to develop a long-range transportation plan, submit that plan to OHDOT for acceptance. We choose that word acceptance carefully. We're not here to approve it. These regions know, these agencies know what their region needs. So OHDOT is not about to step in and tell these RTPOs that, wait, you got this wrong in your plan, you really meant to say this. That's not really our role. We want these agencies to reflect the desires and the wishes and the needs of their communities. And so when they submit it to us, we're just making sure that they have all the components that you would need in a long-range plan, that it's a whole plan. We're not there to tell them what their goals and objectives should be or what their final recommendations should be coming out of it. Once they submit that to OHDOT and we accept it, then we pass along a request to the governor's office, and then the governor designate them as a RTPO. And so that's kind of how they go from growing up from an RPO to an RTPO. So in Ohio right now we have 5 RTPOs. I showed you those on the map earlier. And we actually have added a new RPO in Central Ohio called Corpo. What's interesting about this is that this RPO wasn't, again, born from nothing. The MPO in Central Ohio, the MPO in Columbus, Ohio, looked at this program that we had going on at OHDOT to create RTPOs, and they instantly recognized this as something that was needed. In Central Ohio, Morpsey, the MPO, it's a 2-county MPO, but there are sort of counties, 7 counties that are sort of in the halo around the metropolitan area that are very rural in characteristic, but they all have a similarity in that they're sort of bedroom communities for Columbus. A lot of people live there, drive in for work, and drive back out. And so even though they're kind of all spread around, they all are in a halo around Columbus. And so they created a new RPO, and they are just now finishing up their 2-year pilot with us. That pilot ends on June 30th, and we are anticipating receiving the first draft of their long-range plan here very soon. And so just on the map, you can see the original 5 agencies. There's Maumee Valley Regional Planning Commission in the upper northwest, LUC, OVRDC, Buckeye Hills, and Omega. In the center, that sort of yellowish orange C, Corpo, is that MPO or that RPO I was just telling you about, sort of the halo counties around Morpsey. And then you'll see off to the west edge of the state and the far north edge of the state some counties in yellow. Those are counties that we've heard of, and they're just beginning to talk. They're just beginning to think about this, and they're just inquiring, hey, if we organize, if we create an RPO, what does that mean? How does that help our communities in our region? And so those areas are just now beginning to explore that possibility. So how are RPOs funded? We fund them here in Ohio with our federal SPR funds, Part 1 funds. And so we use 80% federal funds. We kick in 10% of state funds, and then we require the local RPO or TPO to come up with a 10% match. Our budget this year has been about $850,000. Now, how we distribute that around is every agency, whether RPO or TPO, it doesn't matter, they get about $60,000 as a base. And then on top of that, how much more they received above that is broken down as about 50% based on the population of the region and 50% based on the total area, square miles of their region. And so that's kind of how we've come up with a process. Is this the best? I don't know. This is what we came up with. So far, it seems to be working. But as we go on down the road and we learn more, we might need to tweak this some. Now, the big question that everyone asks is, well, what about capital funding? We're giving them planning dollars to do planning. What about capital? When can they start getting funding to use to do projects? And right now, we don't have any capital funds that we designate to them. MPOs, by federal law, get certain suballocated funds, federal funds that they use in their regions. RTPOs in Ohio don't have that yet. Just like everyone else in the country, transportation funding is getting more tight. It's incredible short supply. Everyone's looking around trying to figure out how are we going to get more funds for transportation, for infrastructure. And so Ohio is just like everyone else. We haven't come up with our solution yet, but when we do come up with that global solution for bringing in more funding for transportation and infrastructure, whatever that solution is, that is when we're hoping to be able to begin funding and providing capital funds to our RTPOs. What sort of work do they do? It's this type of work that you would expect that you might see at an MPO. Yes, they're doing safety and corridor studies. They're doing safe routes to school plans and active transportation plans, asset management, data collection, all those things that you would expect to see a regional planning organization do. That's what they do. And last but not least is assisting locals with grant writing to apply for OHDOT funds. Now, what authority do they have? Actually, they don't have any authority, but I thought if I just put none on a slide, that was really boring. So what I'm saying here is that these organizations, they are voluntary organizations. Communities are coming together to create these RTPOs, and so they exist. Their sole purpose is to serve their member communities and member agencies. And so even though there's no law that requires them to do things or to produce certain products, it's become a best practice in Ohio. And in Ohio, once they are created, the Ohio DOT recognizes them as our official partner in the rural consultation process. And so they are very valuable to OHDOT and a key player to OHDOT. And so with that, I think we've covered all that I had in the outline, and I'll turn it back over to Jamie to put a question to everyone.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And again, we will take questions at this time. On the left-hand side is the chat pod. If you could put any questions in there. In the meantime, we are going to ask our audience another poll. You'll notice the chat pod is still there now that I've moved screens, so feel free to put those questions in. So the question for the audience, which of the following are the steps for starting an RTPO in Ohio? Complete a 2-year pilot program, develop an RPO committee-approved regional LRTP, submit a plan to OHDOT for acceptance, OHDOT submits the request to the governor for RPO to be formally designated as an RTPO, all of the above, none of the above, or I don't know, I don't remember. We'll give everyone just a few minutes to fill that out. Okay, and it does look like everyone has filled out the question, so I broadcast those results for you. Scott, if you want to go ahead and talk through those answers, please.
Well, once again, everyone seems to have got this right. Yeah, it is all above. Those are the basic steps of forming an RTPO in Ohio. This is the process that we developed with the first set of 5, and it seems to have worked very well. And so, we're not going to mess with success. It's worked well. We're going to stick with this as we move forward, and hopefully this provides a good guide for other states that might be interested in trying to create RPOs, RTPOs in their state as well.
Perfect. Thank you. And we do appreciate you taking the time to talk about your case study in Ohio as well. It does not look like we have any questions, so we are going to move on to our next speaker. And again, we will have one more question period. Please feel free to put those questions in the chat pod at any time if you do have them. And right now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Matt.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I think throughout a lot of this presentation, you'll see quite a few similarities between the Ohio example and as well as what Steve talked about regarding some of the regional organizations. So from the beginning here in Washington, we've actually had regional transportation planning organizations around for quite a while, since the early 90s. Before we dip into more of the meat of the presentation with incorporating locals and kind of differentiating between some of the MPOs and RTPOs here, I think it's still important to give a bit of a background, albeit shortened, of how Washington State has had RTPOs in place for quite some time and some of the duties that they have here. So what I'm going to cover today is really the purpose of an RTPO. I think you'll see some overlap, but most of it is regional planning again. I'll go over how Washington funds the RTPOs. While it is established in state law, there are some peculiarities around that, so I will discuss those too here in Washington, as well as the organizational structure and, of course, the duties of an RTPO prior to dipping into some of involvement at the local level. So right here, what you see on the screen is actually the rolling wheat fields of the Palouse. Believe it or not, we do have regional transportation planning organizations here that are much more rural in nature, that are not tied to any sort of MPO, and this is a typical picture of what that would look like, SR 26 in Eastern Washington. Also home to Washington State University in Pullman. Moving forward to the purpose of an RTPO, the two main reasons that RTPOs were established in state law is really to coordinate transportation planning and then to develop a regional transportation plan for a county. Here in Washington, we do have what's called a Growth Management Act. It does restrict growth a bit in urban areas, but also has many good uses specifically tied around transportation and land use. And in Washington, the regional transportation planning organizations are fully involved in this process, depending on the county that they're in. Regarding an RTPO, we do have 15 RTPOs in Washington State currently. 5 of those are standalone organizations, and we are just about to have a 16th RTPO as well that I will dip into as we continue through the presentation. Regarding the funding in Washington, so Washington State supports and funds the RTPOs 100%. Of course, no federal funding is involved, no local matches involved. It's a straight $4.4 million per biennium, which we have here in Washington for the soon-to-be 16 RTPOs. Here in Washington, we also have MPOs that are different than RTPOs in the fact that they have work programs. However, the RTPOs have a work program as well. So with each state fiscal year here in Washington, which is, of course, July 1 through June 30, the RTPOs have a work program that is reviewed by the state DOT and the other locals involved. And then where there's an MPO, they also include their work program with the MPO's work program. And in an alignment with MPOs, there's also an annual reporting requirement for Washington State RTPOs in that 90 days after the end of the state fiscal year, they're required to report to the state on what they've done with that funding. Now, the $4.4 million is actually a formula that's spread out mostly based on population throughout the state of Washington, and it's distributed amongst the RTPOs. I'm not going to get into the specifics with how a base is allotted in there and then population, but just to know that that $4.4 million, the primary driver is population. And so the establishment criteria, unlike Ohio, it's very prescriptive here in Washington. A majority of this law has been around since the early 90s. If you look in bullet point number 1 here, encompassing at least one county, the one county RTPOs are primarily the RTPOs in Washington that are also associated with an MPO due to a higher population. Because of course the single county RTPOs generally do have at least 100,000 folks. As you see through here, and I use the word prescriptive because in the second clause here, of a population of at least 75,000 in a state ferries terminal, this actually applies to one county in the state, Island County, which became an RTPO a couple years back. And then the next clause you see here, having a population of at least 40,000 and covered geographic area of at least 5,000 square miles, that actually has to do with Okanogan County, which is just about to become an RTPO in Washington in the near term, probably within the next month. Reason being, as many folks could probably understand, there's challenges and needs that certain counties determine as they've gone through the years of being an RTPO that they really want to have a tighter knit group of maybe one county or two counties be that RTPO, and as long as they meet the population thresholds, they're allowed to do that. So Okanogan County, with this clause added by our legislature this year, can now be an RTPO. So as you see, Ohio, it's really broad and frankly left up to, it seems to be most of the state, to determine between ODOT and the locals of how they do become regional transportation planning organizations under the Fed type of definition. But here in Washington, it's very specific to who and can become an RTPO. Moving on to the next slide. So who typically makes up these RTPOs? I know we've talked about, up until now, mostly the non-metropolitan requirement as it's stated in Fed law under MAP 21 for an RTPO. But here in Washington, it's actually both. So wherever there's an MPO, if an RTPO, of course, is in that area, then the Transportation Policy Board looks very similar. You'll notice here cities and towns, counties, and the laundry list here. It does include urban and rural folks that are both part of this regional transportation planning organization. And of course, unlike many of the states where y'all are from, I've worked a bit in North Carolina prior to this, and of course, there as well, there was metropolitan planning organizations, but around those MPOs in the rural areas, of course, they have rural planning organizations. So that's kind of to differentiate the donut hole in some states versus the all-in approach here in Washington. The other thing I'd like to note on here is that it's not required, but the RTPOs are encouraged to include tribes involved in the planning process as well. Many do, but we have 29 federally recognized tribes in Washington state, so that's also another addition. Regarding some of the duties, again, many of the duties you'll see here are not too far unlike what you would expect from a metropolitan planning organization. However, they are a bit prescriptive. There is a transportation strategy that each region is required to develop here in Washington, and our TPOs are primarily involved in that process. Of course, they're required to develop a regional transportation plan consistent with countywide planning policies. The one thing I'll note on this is that our TPOs are heavily involved in land use decisions, rights of way, things like that. So they do work with the state on these areas as well, which does link up to, of course, our statewide plan, which does touch on land use too. Regarding the update cycle, the RTPs, these regional transportation plans, should be updated every so often. Law does say for currency every 2 years. However, I will add that many of the RTPOs in Washington, for simplicity purposes, do align their RTP updates with their Metropolitan Transportation Plan updates if they're associated with an MPO. So as many of you know, the MPO is required to update their MTP every 4 or 5 years, depending on air quality conformity. So a lot of the MPOs that are also RTPOs align to have metropolitan and regional transportation plans. Again, they're certifying their local comprehensive plans from the county. So in Washington, there's a requirement under growth management that each county have a comp plan. So this comp plan that encompasses all the policies and future goals and current needs of the county that's listed in there. The RTPO actually certifies that. And then, of course, we do also have in state law where an RTPO will develop a regional transportation improvement program. And it's a 6-year program, unlike a typical 4-year TIP that you'd see from a metropolitan planning organization. The update does occur generally every 2 years, but again, where there is an MPO in Washington, they tend to align with the RTPO if it's the same organization. And then some of these here, these bullets here have to do with how the RTPOs are really linked into level of service. So like an MPO that looks at level of service, RTPOs here in Washington also look at level of service standards established and used by their counties. And when it comes to working with other modes, the RTPOs are also very involved with working with the various modes, active transportation, the bike ped folks, where there is the ferry system here in Washington. Primarily Puget Sound Regional Council works very closely with our state ferry system. Of course, all work with the state highway system to carry out those responsibilities. And I will touch on it, but they are required also to work with the human services transportation plans that are in federal and state law. So as you'll see here, we have an agency council for coordinated transportation. They actually work with the locals to prioritize HSTPs and projects, and then the RTPOs in Washington are actually the leads for those. So in some states where human services transportation plans are doled out to counties, in Washington, the HSTP funds are actually doled out to RTPs in many cases, RTPOs, and then, of course, those RTPOs are responsible for developing the HSTPs with their locals. Transit's involved, of course, as well as all their member jurisdictions. So incorporating locals into the process, now that I've kind of laid the groundwork for what an RTPO does in Washington, I will kind of begin this by saying that many folks that don't know what an RTPO is can be suspect. We have individuals that say, we don't want state money, we'll have to do all these requirements. So it is an educational experience for especially some of the newer RTPOs here in Washington that have developed over the past several years in Island County and then now in Okanogan County. But when we really educate them on what an RTPO's advantages can be, they start to see that there are positives. Many of the rural areas, like most of you know, don't have key planning staff. Many of them can be green to what transportation planning is. So one of the things that, from a state perspective, we suggested is that some RTPOs, they'll have an on-call planning consultant. So for $20,000, $30,000 a year, if they have a planning consultant that they know they can call for a multi-county region that's generally rural in nature, they can really have experts that can assist them, whereas they may not have that if they're not part of an RTPO. So they can also leverage existing planning in counties with their RTPO funds. So in addition to on-call planning consultants, some RTPOs choose to use the RTPO funds to pay for already established planning functions and elevate them. Primarily this can include any sort of GIS or data training for those folks for the region. And of course, the additional data results in a better product for their regional transportation plan. So that's key, is that really this program does provide technical skills to rural parts of the state that otherwise may not have had it. The other thing is that the state here, of course, like many states, have our policy goals: safety, mobility, accessibility, those types of things. And so the local policy goals then can use and align with the state policy goals. So that's how we really try to say here, the locals plan is really our state plan. They shouldn't really be different. And then I kind of touched on the second to last bullet about resistance, in that leveraging planning resources can be helpful in a lot of the rural areas, but in a lot of the urban areas where there's already an MPO, resistance is pretty minimal just because the MPOs have already established planning staff, so they essentially just tack on the RTPO duties with their established MPO. And then, of course, working with individuals that may not have been included in the planning process before. This is pretty obvious. Many rural areas, folks don't really know what transportation planning is. They jump right to projects. And when they really have an organization like an RTPO that can get at the 30,000-foot level, look down and say, here are the needs of the region, and not just one specific city or one specific area of a county, that's always helpful. We did an exercise when we do this with some policy boards around the state of folks that are on these RTPO policy boards and say, who cares about safety? Who cares about mobility? And you see hands up around the table. And so folks that are really skeptical at the outset of forming an RTPO, we find they really come around when they can see some of the positives that can result. So kind of to close out and differentiate, I will, of course, say that RTPOs are established in state law in Washington. When the MAP 21 RTPOs were actually put out with the NPRM back when the planning rule was put out and was, of course, then solidified and established in 23 CFR 45210, WashDOT and the RTPOs took a collaborative approach in making comments to that docket. And we said, we appreciate the fact basically that, that USDOT is recognizing that non-metropolitan planning needs to exist in states across the country, but please let us continue on with our existing RTPO program we have here in Washington. So just wanted to emphasize that's how our program really differs from that listed in MAP 21. And then, of course, we all know that federal legislation created the MPOs. Kind of touching on it again, there are 12 MPOs in Washington, and where there are those 12 MPOs, those organizations are also the RTPO in staff and in coverage area. So that's just really to leverage and not duplicate planning efforts where there's already an MPO, but also elevate planning efforts in areas of the state where there's not an MPO, which of course are the rural areas. The designation process, I'll just touch on very quickly, differs a bit from Ohio in the fact that the RTPO and WashDOT work together to help an RTPO be formed. We provide technical assistance to the area and to the region. When they get their verification packet together of interlocal agreements, any bylaws that have been approved by the policy board that they're forming, they submit that to the state, and it's actually WashDOT, Washington State DOT, that certifies an RTPO and not necessarily the governor here. So that's a bit of a difference. And then moving on to some of the other differentiations, of course, like I said, most of the time where there's an MPO, they try to align their metropolitan transportation update with their regional transportation plan update. So when you look at MPOs across the state, many are metropolitan and regional transportation plan updates. Where there's an RTPO, they simply have a regional transportation plan. Of course, here, and like everywhere, the MPO tip is approved by the governor. The RTPO tip is approved by the policy board of that RTPO and provided to WashDOT for information, so we can then include projects in our statewide transportation improvement program. In Washington State, RTPOs develop and work with locals in creating the human services transportation plans. And of course, like I said, they really elevate those countywide planning policies and then do certify local comp plans. So with that being said, thank you for listening, and I'll take a look at the question here.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Matt. And again, this is our last question and answer period. So for any of you who do have questions for any of our speakers, please feel free to put those in the chat pod on the left-hand side. And we do have one more question for our audience. So true or false, RTPOs may exist in areas where MPOs are already formed, as well as areas of Washington State that are rural. It does look like most people are done. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and broadcast the results for you, Matt, if you'd like to speak about it.
Sure. So, yeah, and again, it looks like most folks did get it right. In Washington, we do have that unique situation where RTPOs do exist in areas where there are metropolitan planning organizations, and then RTPOs are also permitted to exist in certain parts of the state that are rural. So I'm glad that folks did get that differentiation out of the presentation.
Thank you. And we do have one question that came in, and I'd like to ask all three of you to address it. And we'll start with Matt. We have a question asking whether or not RTPOs care much about Vision Zero.
Yes, they do.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes. Thank you, Jamie. Yes, they actually do. Here in Washington, we call it Target Zero, but our highway safety plan. So the MPOs and RTPOs, where they're mutual organizations and where they have mutual plans, they do plan and program projects towards achieving Target Zero. And they are, and all the MPOs in our state, along with the RTPOs that are part of those MPOs, are supportive of our state targets that we did set under Target Zero and, of course, linked to MAP 21. Where there are parts of the state that there is standalone RTPOs, so those RTPOs clearly weren't created by any sort of federal law. WashDOT actually does work with their RTPOs when we do work with them on planning and programming projects that it is in support of our Target Zero. So, yes.
Perfect. Thank you. And how about Scott and Oregon?
Ohio.
Oh, sorry, Ohio.
That's fine. Yeah, they very much do. Our RTPOs do care about safety. They, the state DOT has been working on safety locations on the state system for years and years, and have made great strides. But we're finding that it's some of the local systems that really need more help, and so the RTPOs in Ohio are rising to the challenge, and they're working with their local communities to crunch the data, look at those crash reports, find out where the high crash locations are, and then work with their local communities on submitting grant requests to OHDOT for projects that will address some of those safety issues. And so they have been embedded in each of our OHDOT districts, have district safety review teams, and the RTPO members have been embedded in those teams, and so they're aware of the safety issues going on in their region and provide valuable input to OHDOT into how to spend some of our safety resources.
Thank you. And Stephen, do you have any comments as well from the noteworthy practice
side?
Sure.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, the states we've talked to, I think it is. It's always on their menu of planning work. I think many of them have learned and continue to recognize that, in many states it's more than half of the fatalities are on two-lane rural roads. And it's a difficult challenge to try to deal with both the infrastructure and driver behavior on the rural highway network, particularly, well, both two-lane state highways and local roads. So I think they care. I think they understand the challenge. I think, as Scott said, they are encouraged in many states to bring that rural safety perspective forward to the state DOT so that the focus is not wholly metropolitan where the mileage numbers are bigger, or high system, national highway system, but to try to shift that focus to where a lot of the fatalities and serious injuries happen on the rural roads.
Perfect. Thank you all for your insights on that question. We do have a few final slides for everyone. The next couple of slides are from the National Association of Development Organizations. They do have a lot of resources that are available to everyone, so we wanted to make sure that you knew about them. With membership, resources, and support from federal agencies and other funders, the National Association of Development Organizations Research Foundation has collected sample bylaws and other documents from RTPOs and regional development organizations involved in transportation, as well as planning documents produced by organizations around the nation. And these are available to you. So here are some examples. If you go to their website, ruraltransportation.org, they do have resources from NATO, federal agencies, and other regional and national partners shared on this website. And they are shared through the free Rural Transportation newsletter as well, which is a periodic newsletter that is published every 2 to 3 months. And you can sign up to receive that newsletter on their homepage at ruraltransportation.org. With assistance from the Federal Highway Administration, the NATO Research Foundation has written several case studies and reports on a variety of topics for RTPOs. The Regional Rural Transportation Planning Report on this slide, as one example, describes the models used by state DOTs to partner with regional organizations to conduct transportation planning and support statewide planning efforts. This information is organized by state in the RTPO model section of the ruraltransportation.org website. And you can also access these resources on your own, but if you do have any questions, you can contact NATO staff for more information. And again, I do not work for NATO, so I can't answer any questions about these resources, but if you do have them, I can pass you along to our contact at NATO. She was unable to be here today, but did want to make sure that you guys knew these resources exist. So in today's webinar, the things we hope you've learned is to identify noteworthy practices in regional transportation planning, to summarize how to start an RTPO from scratch using our Ohio case study, and then how to differentiate between an MPO and an RTPO, such as those in Washington. And lastly, to illustrate how to incorporate locals into the decision-making process when creating an RTPO. We do have, as the Safety Center, an upcoming webinar in April on the 26th, and this one will be on sharing the road with slow-moving vehicles, to include everything from horse and buggies to construction vehicles to non-motorized as well. So we hope you'll be able to join us. As I mentioned earlier, we do archive all of these webinars, and they are available on our website. Today's we hope to be up there by tomorrow. And if you do have any further questions that didn't get asked or answered today, this is the information for all of our speakers today, as well as the information for how to contact us at the Safety Center. I do want to thank all three of our speakers again. I really do appreciate the three of you taking your time. So Stephen, Scott, and Matt, thank you very, very much for doing your presentations again. This will be a great resource to have archived on our website for years to come. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Everybody have a great afternoon. Thank you.